Hey everyone, I'm Matt Freedman, Matt of the Oracle. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. Last week we talked about contrarian strategies for tournaments. This week we're going to talk about strategies for constructing NBA cash game lineups. Let's get started. Our guest for the week making his return to the roundtable is Adam Levitan on Twitter at Adam Levitan. He's a DraftKings analyst, a co-host of the Daily Fantasy Football Edge podcast, a FantasyLabs writer, and a two-time FSWA award winner. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Hey, can you guys see Jerry back there? If you guys are watching on the video feed, Jerry's taking a little schluff back there, so check her out.
Jerry. Yeah, we can see her, and I'm glad that John's bashing of the 76ers on the previous show didn't prevent you from coming back.
I missed that, man. What did he say about my Sixers? That's not cool.
Yeah, I don't exactly remember what it was. It was a low-level dig, so it's not the type to stick in your memory, but I remember that he said it.
Okay, yeah, future 2020, 2021 NBA champions.
Exactly. All right, good to have you on the show. And returning to the show is Justin Phan at JFan. He's a managing director of FantasyLabs and the man behind the FantasyLabs projections, as well as the model that bears his name. One could say that it is a fan favorite. And yes, I have more of those bad puns in store for later in the evening. Justin, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm good to go. If we drop any more of these awful puns, I might have to walk off the set. So just fair warning that might be coming, and you might have a three-man pod here.
Fantastic. All right. Finally, making his roundtable debut is the one and only Peter Jennings at CSU Ram 88. He's a co-founder of FantasyLabs, an ESPN contributor, a DraftKings analyst, and the winner of a shipload of DFS money. Peter, welcome to the show.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun time. I'm a fan of Justin Phan, and throw as many as we can in there throughout the show now. It should be fun. I'm excited to talk a variety of different things about strategy and whatnot, so it should be fun.
All right, let's jump into it. A lot of people focus on tournaments because that's where you can make the most money, but I think really the true skill of a DFS player is revealed through the regular grind of creating cash game lineups that win consistently over a longer period of time. So in other words, winning tournaments, it's great, but if you want to become a true daily player with a self-sustaining bankroll, you need to put a lot of attention into your cash game lineups. So let's jump into it. Adam, let's start with you. We were talking specifically about the NBA. How does the process of creating cash game lineups for this sport differ from the process you use with other sports?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The first thing that comes to mind is there's just no punts whatsoever in NBA cash games. Like, I don't punt anything. And I think, in NFL, like, I try not to punt also, but sometimes I find myself with, like, Heath Miller in cash because he's 2,800 on DraftKings. Or, like, I think I played Austin Seferian-Jenkins. He was 2,700 in cash on DraftKings. And that worked out okay, even though they dudded, because it allowed me to get to guys like Julio and Beckham. And those guys can really like carry a cash team. But like, unless you have an Anthony Davis type performance from Sunday where he goes for like 90 DraftKings points, really your stars are going to score around what they're expected to, in the 50 to 60 range. And that means that you need the value that you get from your cheap plays or your cheaper plays also. So like, there's just absolutely no punts in the NBA, whereas there would be in the NFL. And then also, the other thing is correlation. We think about that so much with baseball, and we think about it so much with football, with NBA. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but I think that the correlation stuff, I try to play guys in cash. Maybe like tonight is an example. I played 4 guys from the Magic in cash to kind of soak up all that value. So I think that's kind of something that we can think about in NBA more so than the other sports.
Mm-hmm. Justin, Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll talk about my process. I think just the process of it is very different, that it's so news driven, and it's really the only sport, NBA, is that you can do hours upon hours of research and have it scrapped and go to waste like in the final 20 to 30 minutes before lock. I think for me, it's really being flexible in NBA is really important as opposed to other sports. When I head into a slate a day, I don't really like lock into any players really. I'll have a list of guys that I'll target and whatnot, but I always want to remain open-minded, flexible, in case some dramatic value shifts happen during that last hour and a half before lock. I think also, matchup still matters in NBA, but a little less to me than MLB and NFL. I think usage, minutes, opportunity matter a lot more to me in NBA, and I'll look at things like the game spread for blowout potential, those type of things a little bit more than matchup. Where MLB, you can figure out where batters facing X pitcher, and NFL strength of opposing run defense, opposing pass defense. It's a little bit more matchup dependent there, and NBA it's a lot more fluid overall.
Peter.
Justin just stole my point, but just to tack on to that very last part, I think in the NBA, the matchup actually matters the least to any other sport, pretty much. I think it's more about opportunity than any other sport. If you compare it to football, which I think is probably the next most important for opportunity, I think the matchup still matters so much more in football than it does in NBA. Obviously, it's not ideal, but if a player is going to play, 40 minutes who's a backup or whatever, and they're really cheap, they're going to hit value so often just given the opportunity regardless of the matchup. So I think that's one thing you have to consider all the time when you're playing cash games, is just how much opportunity are my players going to get.
Yeah, kind of going off of that too. I think with NFL especially, it's so touchdown dependent. And NBA, there's so many more ways, so many ways to score points and rack up DK and FanDuel points, that it's not all about matchup. Like Pete said, that, you can impact the game in a variety of ways. If you're not a scorer, you can still dish and rebound and get some steals here and there. So they're definitely that plays into the matchup mattering a little less.
Justin, in tournaments, you want multiple lineups that are unique and there's less focus on being optimal. In cash games, it's pretty much the opposite. Optionality is king, optimality is king. But what criteria do you use to decide if a lineup is truly the optimal lineup for any given slate?
Yeah, my definition of optimal is different from what most people think optimal is. I think most people think optimal is you click the optimizer and then you spits out the lineup combination that scores the most points. And that's not what I really go by. For me, optimal is really about range of outcomes and kind of limiting my downside. And I want to, first thing I want to do is when I go through my lineup, I want to like every player on my roster. I don't want to ever play a player just because he fits in my salary cap. So if I see a player in there that I don't like, I'm just going to keep tinkering and reworking until I like my lineup from top to bottom. I also think for me in cash, when I make my lineup, I want to kind of avoid situations where there's significant risk and downside. So I'll tend to stay away from players that are in double-digit spreads, or they play for coaches who run really loose and liberal rotations where they might play 28 minutes instead of the 34, 35 that I want them to play. So it's really more about kind of aligning my range of outcomes and kind of limiting my downside while still having a little, upside and ceiling worked into the mix.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one mistake that people make, maybe people that are new to FantasyLabs, is they just go to the Phan model and they click the optimizer and it spits out the lineup and they just run that lineup out there. I don't think that's the intention. I mean, Justin can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's the intention of the optimizer. I click on it sometimes to see maybe something that I'm missing or a different kind of lineup construction that I'm missing. But I have guys that I'm definitely playing because I think that their floor is 4x on FanDuel or whatever. And I'm definitely playing those guys, and maybe it doesn't come out in the optimizer due to scarcity or something like that. But yeah, maybe Justin can talk more about the optimizer and how he thinks it should be used.
No, I totally agree with that. And I think that's a big issue. And I think people kind of expect to come on the site, make, 2 or 3 clicks and then win a lot of money. It just doesn't work that way. There's a lot more nuance into it. If you run our multiple lineup tool and maybe run 50 lineups, you'll notice that the difference between those from 1 to 10 is 1 or 2 DK points. And there's very little difference between the first optimal lineup and the 5th optimal lineup. It's all about kind of finding the version of those optimal lineups that kind of fits your style and your needs the best.
Right. And one thing I want to add there too, that I think is a big consideration for a lot of people when talking about one optimal lineup, is the concept of hedging. And certain nights I don't hedge at all. I run one lineup, and other nights I run, 2 lineups and potentially even more. There's a lot of plays that I think are really close. And basically some nights it's very obvious. There's one lineup where you just get everyone, all the value plays fit together. and it's far and away, the highest has the highest expected value of any other lineup. But most nights, everything's very close. And some nights you'll have a value play at shooting guard and a stud at power forward that you want to play. And there's there's James Harden and a, cheap power forward that you want to play as well. 2 versus 2 or 3 versus 3 hedge, I think makes sense in certain nights in cash games, depending on how many options there are and like positional scarcity, things of that nature.
Peter, in tournaments, you want to have lineups that have high ceilings. And with cash games, people generally talk about wanting lineups that have a higher floor. Both Adam and Justin mentioned that earlier. What do you think about this focus on floor? Do you think people should do that, or do you think they should maybe focus more on expected median production? Like, how is it that you approach the idea, I guess, of safety in cash games?
Safety is definitely important, but I think people value it too much in cash games. I certainly, always want to play guys that I'm confident are going to get a lot of opportunity in the NBA. Generally, don't take a lot of risk in guys with a wide range of minutes. But I do think it's important to identify players who might have a higher ceiling, because in cash games, still have a great night to sustain a really good ROI. You need those nights where you sweep the board. If you're playing 3-mans or even 5-mans, which could be considered cash games, you still need lineups that are going to, put up a top 10 percentile, top 1 percentile score occasionally. So I think that you should focus on upside as well. But I do value floor more in cash games. Obviously, floor is pretty much meaningless in tournaments where, basically you just want to get in the top 10%. So I do think it's something that's undervalued. I know Adam had talked about in the past where, he really wants that big score so he can win 95% of his cash games and sweep the board.
Yeah, I play mostly head-to-head for my cash games. Like, I post at all buying levels just all day, just keep posting head-to-heads. So there's a huge difference for me between winning, 55% of my head-to-heads and winning 95% of my head-to-heads. So I'm really looking for ceiling. So I'm willing to sacrifice like a little bit of downside. I've played like Zach Levine off the bench, which I think may have been a little bit thin a couple times for his downside and kind of for his role on that team. But I thought that his ceiling was worth it. So, yeah, I think that taking a little bit of risk with your cash lineup to have a higher ceiling is something that people don't do enough of. But, yeah, it seems like every night we should be able to find, for the majority of our lineup, guys whose bottom of their range is around 4x value, I think.
I think it also depends. I mean, both Adam and Pete hit on this, is the type of cash games you play. You want to emphasize floor a lot more, and things like 50-50s where you just have to beat half the field and just not make those types of mistakes. And then you want to emphasize ceiling a little bit more in those head-to-heads where, like Adam said, it makes a big difference if you're winning, 50% of your head-to-heads versus like 70-80%.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think attached to this idea of safety is also the idea of consistency. And Adam, it's generally considered a good thing for cash game lineups. Now, I guess a question that I have here is, given that risk is spread across 8 to 9 players in any given portfolio, any given lineup that you've created, is it okay to start players who might be a little more volatile, knowing that the other players in the lineup might balance out that risk?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about this question before, and I'm not sure I'm mathematically inclined enough to answer this. I know what you mean. I think what you mean is that the more, the wider your sample is, and our sample is our lineup, it kind of mitigates the risk because they all have, X amount of risk. I don't know. I don't really think of it that way. Maybe I should be. I think of it more on a player-to-player basis, not in terms of my whole lineup. The way that I think about it more across the whole lineup is like what I already mentioned, is like I thought it was a great spot for Orlando tonight, and I had no problem using for Magic tonight in cash to kind of soak that up. But yeah, it'd be interesting what the other guys had to say about that, because I hadn't really thought about that too much.
Hey, Peter, how about you? Because I know you have that finance background. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It is interesting. And I think that, there's players like an Andre Drummond, for example, who might have a wide range depending on his night. Where the upside is obviously there, but they have a lower floor. It's one thing that I don't look at a ton. I think it's definitely something to target in tournaments, especially if you can catch the guy coming off a couple bad games, because their price will generally go down. So it's a great time to buy low. Is buying low on a player on a cold streak who's very volatile, and that's one way I think about it. But in general, I'm targeting a little bit more consistent guys in cash games, especially in NBA. Because in an NBA, you have guys that are pretty consistent in general. They're getting a lot of minutes, they're getting a lot of opportunity, and the variance of their performance isn't as high. Whereas a sport like baseball, you can obviously see the guy who's in a slump or very hot. That's a tougher sport to kind of figure out, but definitely a good question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, the consistency thing for me in NBA is different, right? Like, we can think of consistency as minutes, and that's like the most valuable thing for me is consistency in minutes, not consistency in performance. So, like, if I see a guy who has been playing 35 minutes every night but not playing well, like, that doesn't bother me whatsoever to use him in cash. So, like, inability to project minutes accurately, which Justin does an unbelievable job of, is probably the most valuable thing you can possibly think of in NBA.
All right, let's move on. Justin, I think that salary relief is easier to find in tournaments than in cash games because in tournaments you can grab a cheap guy who's likely to be under-owned, then that can give you a unique lineup. In cash games, the most important thing is that every guy in the lineup lives up to his salary or surpasses his salary expectations. How do you go about finding salary relief in cash games without sacrificing production? Are there particular positions that you target in an attempt to find cheap players?
Yeah, it's really always tricky to find punt plays in NBA, and especially on DK where the pricing is so weird sometimes, and it's hard to kind of fit those guys in. But yeah, I think the first thing with salary relief and punt plays is news related, injury related. I think we always have a couple guys come up later in the day that are scratched, and the replacements come up and get more minutes, more opportunity. In terms of rigid rules, I kind of tend to look at point guard, power forward, and center as my positions to target in terms of cheaper guys. Point guards being that they have the ball in their hands a lot, opportunity to kind of control the tempo, to control the action, and they're kind of always in a way involved at the start of the possession. Power forwards and center, close to the basket, a lot of rebounding opportunities, block opportunities, kind of those cheap ways to pay the bills and maybe sniff a double here and there. But that's generally how I look at it. It is really tricky though to consistently find punt plays. I usually, as a whole, when constructing my cash game lineups, don't go stars and scrubs. I kind of go a little bit more balanced just because it's harder to find those cheaper guys who are consistent and reliable and don't offer like significant downside.
Yeah, I've talked to Peter about this before, but like I feel way better about a point guard sliding into the starting lineup than a big man. It just feels like, maybe I should have data on this to back up what I'm saying, but it just feels to me like point guards who, there's just more like talented people walking the earth that are under 6'3" than there are that are like 7 feet tall. Like there's a lot of really good backup point guards, and they have the ball so much, like they have a way better chance of performing than say a backup big man that comes in and maybe isn't used to guarding frontline players and gets into foul trouble. So I feel really way better about using point guards as kind of replacement players than big men.
Adam took one of my points. I was going to talk about point guards as well, just because they have the ball in their hands. Their usage in general is going to be high relative to other positions for guys coming in. And that's really the big theme with, taking guys who are cheap in NBA. You want to be taking guys who are cheap, who are, thrusted into a new opportunity, whether it be injury or a new role. And oftentimes, your night's going to depend how you construct your roster based on how many players are in that position. So there's only a couple guys who are in that position, then it's probably more of a balanced night, but there's tons of value across the industry, lots of injuries, lots of players in good spots, and you can go more of a stars and scrubs type strategy. So it's definitely dependent on the night, and I never try to have like rigid rules with something like this.
Peter, I have a follow-up question on this. So we just talked about particular positions maybe in which you could find cheap players. Are there particular types of teams in which you think it is easier to find cheap players, either teams that are overperforming or teams that are underperforming, but maybe the salaries for that team are even lower than expectations for how they might perform?
It is interesting. One thing that I look for a particular team is towards the end of the year is where they are in terms of record and where they have incentive to play. You can find a ton of value at the end of the year in teams that don't have much of an incentive to play, and they're resting all the veterans, and they're basically relying on a small, very, 7-8 player rotation which gives a lot of new players a lot of opportunity if they're within that rotation. So that's kind of something I'm looking for at the end. It's just so dynamic throughout the year, which teams you want to look for. One thing that I just mentioned, anytime you can find a shorter rotation, that's something that you can take advantage of with a cheap player as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's talk about stacking. Adam had mentioned earlier that I think tonight he's playing 4 players from the same team. In general, stacking is thought of as more of a tournament strategy, but it works differently in the NBA because teammates can cannibalize each other. So, of course, another way of thinking about this is the way that Adam mentioned. You could stack players as a way of locking in points from a given matchup. What do you think about stacking in NBA cash games?
Stacking NBA cash games is not something I actively try to do at all. It just happens sometimes where a team's in a good spot. One thing that I know people do a lot in tournaments, which I think is a bad idea, I know it's not exactly the question, but people stack games a ton in tournaments just hoping for the overtime or the double overtime. While there is value in that to a degree because of the extra minutes, predicting overtime is very, very challenging, and I think people overrate the ability to predict overtime. So that's just one side for stacking. But in general, I don't try to do it. It's not something I'm actively doing. In baseball, obviously it's a great tournament strategy. And even in cash games, if I have something that's very close, a coin flip on a player, and I already have 2 of one team versus none of the other, I'll take the guy that will complete a stack in cash games. So for NBA, it's, again, just way less powerful than any other sport, I really think. So it's not something I'm actively trying to do at all.
Yeah, I agree. It's not something that I'm actively looking for. Sometimes it just happens that way. And we have like these atrocious defenses in the NBA right now, like Sacramento and Philly and the Lakers. And it just feels like when there's a perfect storm of guys that are underpriced and they have this matchup, I end up with the guys. But I'd agree with Peter. That's not something that I'm actively trying to do because like we talked about, they do cannibalize each other's upside.
I mean, in terms of stacking, I think one thing somewhat close to it is kind of making assumptions about the game, how it'll go, the game flow, and stuff like that. And one thing you can look at potentially is playing opposing point guards that are playing each other that you think is going to be in a high-paced scoring type game. I think it's worked for me quite a few times where I played opposing point guards, especially like versus Washington and John Wall, where they just kind of get into like a scoring duel and kind of go back and forth and go a little up tempo. So I think making assumptions is kind of something I look to do, but stacking in general isn't something I go out of my way to pursue.
Yeah, I guess a follow-up question on this to Peter or Adam is that idea of kind of like cross-stacking where you're not really looking to wholly stack a game, have tons of players, but you are thinking about maybe the potential I guess, synergy that could be created by 2 players going at each other. How often do you look for situations like that?
It's interesting. Something I do a decent amount. I talked about how I don't, go out of my way to completely stack a game, but certain games you do see a ton of pace. Anytime you have 2 teams that are both very high in pace, that can be a great, situation where there's a lot of steals and a fast break type game, and you can get what Justin alluded to with great production. So sometimes I will do that. Especially if, like the opposing point guards, it's a great scenario, like a Westbrook versus John Wall. Both those players will make riskier passes. They'll be great on fast break. They'll be pushing the pace, and you can see a lot of additional fantasy production with cross stacking.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it enough. There's certain situations where I think like when people play maybe like Horford and Millsap together in a tournament, I think can be bad because there's only so many rebounds to go around. But I haven't thought about enough situations like that, correlation between positions on opposing teams and correlation between on the same team. That's something that I think we probably have the data on FantasyLabs to explore.
All right. Well, we've talked a little bit about, especially Justin has talked about kind of DraftKings pricing being tight, sometimes weird. Let's look at DraftKings specifically. They have a flex and then the utility spot. I wonder how you go about determining what types of players to put in those spots. Like, do you decide on a slate-by-slate basis, or have you noticed trends? Do you tend to put a point guard in the guard flex, for instance, a center in the utility spot? Adam, what are your thoughts on how you approach the flex and the utility positions on a slate-by-slate basis?
Yeah, well, first of all, obviously you should put your latest playing player into your flex spot, especially for head-to-head, so you can do the blocking and all that stuff. But in terms of by position, it's a slate by slate thing. But almost always I find myself, not almost always, but typically I find myself playing point guard or center in that spot. It just feels like there's usually the most value I find there and the most ceiling at those two positions. And center, it's kind of frustrating that you can only play one center on FanDuel. Like a lot of times there are a ton of centers that I want to play. It's a pretty deep position. It's certainly deeper than power forward, I think. And so I find myself playing two centers a lot. Shooting guard and small forward, it would be pretty rare for me to play shooting guard or small forward in the flex, but not impossible, I would say.
Yeah, I usually find myself going two centers on DK at least, and you kind of look at my model a lot of the times, and guys like Nick Vucevic, Brook Lopez, Gortat are very high in the model just because they're very softly priced on DraftKings. So as a rule of thumb in general, I usually opt for point guards or centers in those extra flexible spots on DK.
I like going with two centers as well. It's kind of like the same thing. I like playing the tight end on DraftKings for football just because it was a less used position and oftentimes they were just really underpriced. I think center is that position on DraftKings as well. Adam hit on the big thing with the flex is just making sure you have the latest spot. One other thing that you can do with the flex is there's a lot of games at one start time, then a lot more games at a later start time, and you kind of want to keep some flexibility at the end. Make sure that you're thinking about how many guards you have already and how many guards you're going to be using going forward, depending on situation. So you can definitely save yourself by leveraging the flex at the right spot. So I think center is definitely the biggest position. I don't really have any other comments on that.
Mm-hmm. Now, Justin, a site like FanDuel, no flex options in the NBA, and you have two players, you mentioned this, at each position, except for center, you have only one there. How does that inflexibility in lineup construction impact your decisions, or does it even make an impact?
Yeah, it's definitely limiting. I think especially if you look at a position like shooting guard where it's so hard to find value and so hard to find good plays every night, the having to play two at a time, it often makes me kind of pay up a little bit for a floor at a position like shooting guard. Even though they're probably maybe not the highest rated player on my model and not the best like point per dollar player at a position like shooting guard, having to play two kind of makes me pay up for those scarcer positions just for that floor. And then, I'll kind of work things from there. But it just kind of forces you to play players that you usually wouldn't play. And DK, it's a lot better just because you can fit those centers and point guards in there that are really good bargains on a night.
Yeah, playing on FanDuel is to me kind of like a puzzle. You know what I mean? Like we have these plays that we're looking at and we're just trying to see how they fit right. And using the model, I think is a huge help for me there because like you can see, like compare position by position who is a better play when you have close calls. But yeah, like the biggest thing when you're playing on FanDuel is like Justin mentioned, shooting guard and small forward to me, what are you going to do at those two spots? I try to go as low as possible. Like I don't want to play Andrew Wiggins. I don't want to play Klay Thompson. Me and Pete can argue about this, but I don't really want to play Klay Thompson or Andrew Wiggins. I'd rather spend more money at point guard and center, but sometimes I end up playing Wiggins and Klay just because like I don't want the downside that we're exposed to with a lot of the shooting guards and a lot of the cheaper small forwards.
Don't be talking smack about Klay Thompson, man.
He's a very good real life player. I'll say that.
Yeah, very, very good in real life, and he scores. I mean, he's on just a torrid streak of scoring too. So, did you see him the other day? He shot terribly, but he shot like 13 threes or something like that.
Yeah, I know. No, he's been playing great.
The volume of shots, I think, is a little higher for Klay, but that's for another time. It is interesting on FanDuel. I think one thing you really have to consider more so on FanDuel than on DraftKings is just opportunity cost. Sometimes the best point per dollar plays at like a shooting guard position or small forward or whatever, you have to play just because the drop off from them to the next player is so bad. And oftentimes you'll have to, make tough decisions where there's, a great points per dollar player that you might not be able to play because you have to pay up for someone at another position that's really thin. So it's just an opportunity costing on FanDuel and really understanding what you're giving up to fit in a certain guy.
Well, a follow-up question on this. Given everything that's just been said about DraftKings and FanDuel, are there some slates where you look at and you think, okay, I'm not playing on FanDuel tonight. Like, this is just not a FanDuel night. And like vice versa, some slates you look at and you think, well, this is maybe more of a FanDuel slate than a DraftKings slate. Peter, like, are there differences in slates that make you lean towards one site more than another on any given night?
It's a terrible question for me because I play pretty much every slate. But one thing I will say about that, DraftKings, if you're not going to be around, especially for the NBA, that's one sport I won't play unless I know I'm going to be watching basketball on my computer for the entirety of when lineups are going on. In addition to that, maybe a short slate on FanDuel is a little less enticing because there's going to be so much overlap, and on DraftKings you have more flexibility. So that's something I would consider. But again, I find a reason to play a lot of these.
Yeah, I have probably like the egotistical attitude, the wrong attitude that if it's a hard slate for me, it's harder for everybody else. So that's just my, massive ego. So I play all the slates also.
Justin, do you play all the slates?
I do not play all the slates. I like to pick my spots and win all the jelly beans, as people would attest.
All right. So Peter, here's the question. Different types of cash game lineups, and we've talked about this previously, but head-to-heads, 50-50s, double-ups, triple-ups. How do you think is the right way to approach these? What type of allocation with your bankroll do you use for different games? And does that differ depending on the type of player that you are and the type of slate in which you are playing?
All right, so a lot of stuff here. This is a great question, and I think there's a lot of really important points that will help your profitability directly, and something as players we need to be cognizant of. So first of all, the double ups on both DraftKings and FanDuel, and pretty much site-wide or industry-wide, the fees on these games have gone up tremendously. They're no longer the standard that the industry started with. The fees are constantly changing, and most times they're over 10%. So be cognizant of that in the double ups. The 50-50s, those games have the same standard fees, the same percentage. Play those over the double ups because the double ups oftentimes again have more fees. Some of the advantage in the big double ups where you can multi-enter can be overcome even with the higher fees just because the games are a little bit softer, but really pay attention to that because as players we need to speak with our wallets, and I think it's important that these double ups where the fees are higher are not just feeling like crazy versus the 50-50s. Same thing can be said for triple ups. Definitely want to change your lineups for triple ups, especially in sports where correlation matters. You want to make sure you're optimizing and having correlation wherever you can. And then the last point I'd say is that 50-50s are much worse than head-to-heads in terms of a variance standpoint. If you play all 50-50s, you could have a slightly below average lineup and lose every game. Whereas if you played head-to-heads, you might win 40% of those. So make sure you're paying attention to which games you can handle with your bankroll, and then pay attention to those things with the fees.
Yeah, I think game selection, like people might only think about game selection, for 5 minutes out of the day or 1 minute out of their day. And the rest of the time they're thinking about their roster. And really we need to think more about game selection. I think it's so important to try to get your money in as good as possible. Like, when I first played DFS, I've told this story before, but I thought that I was just going to come in and start crushing people, and I started posting 109s on FanDuel, and I kept getting scooped in 0.1 seconds by this guy named Kandia, just over and over and over again. I was like, oh, this guy has no idea what he's in for. He doesn't know who I am, and I just started getting buried. He was just killing me. So then I kind of went back and I was like, wait, I can play $52 games at the same rake level as playing 100. And obviously when you're playing $52 games, you're playing against far weaker opponents than the people that are taking your 109. So it's just figuring out your own process, figuring out a way to get your money in good. And everybody knows who the top players are, you know what I mean? Like if I see a 3-man and, Peter and, Maki Supa are already in it, I'm obviously not getting in that. Like taking the time to look at who's in the 3-mans, look at who's in the 10-mans is really, really worth it in the long run, I think.
Justin, do you have any thoughts on this one?
No, and I think one thing definitely to emphasize is that you should change your lineups really kind of according to what cash games you play, because you need that upside in things like triple ups and double ups, and you want some upside in head to heads, but you can emphasize floor a lot more in things like 50-50s. I think there are different types of cash games that require kind of different types of ranges of outcomes and roster constructions, and I think you shouldn't just throw one cash lineup across the board in all these types of different contests.
All right, guys, good show. Final question here, going around the table one more time. Adam, any closing words of wisdom?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of the cash game. I know it's not sexy. I know chicks don't dig, the grind of playing the cash games, but my mind doesn't work that creatively. You know what I mean? I see some of these lineups that win GPPs, and I just know that I could never, ever get to that lineup. And I understand that about the way my mind works. So I'll play 95% of my action every night in cash games. And, it doesn't bother me that I don't get the glory of, racking up, player of the year points on, whatever site. It really doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me that I don't go to live finals and the Playboy Mansion, swim in the grotto with the playmates. That really doesn't bother me. So I think just having a cash game mentality, I'm going to grind this out and I'm going to see my graph just go like this, for a whole season is rewarding to me.
All right, Justin, closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think you should come in and, like I said, be flexible with your lineups and not be too locked in. I think you should definitely emphasize, like I said, range of outcomes and kind of be cognizant of a player's floor, potential downside, and kind of weigh that with his upside as well. I think I'll say this again: you kind of want to go through your roster player by player and know why you're playing each player, and not just because he shows up in optimal or not just because he fits the salary. I think you always want to just kind of tinker around with your cash game lineup because really, if you do a 1-for-1, 2-for-2, 3-for-3 swap, it can make a world of difference. So I would just keep kind of working and plugging away and kind of find a lineup that you like from top to bottom and kind of fits your style and what you're looking for.
All right, Peter, closing words of wisdom.
Well, I learned something new today on the show, and that's that I would love to trade places with Jerry and just sleep all day behind Adam Levitan and eat treats and go on walks. So that's one thing I learned today. But in all seriousness, for daily fantasy, I think it's really important at this time of the year to really understand the seasonality of DFS. Right now, it's just mostly grinders. This is one of the slower times of the year, if not the slowest time. So really be smart with your bankroll and really game select and be smart, because there's really good times in front of us in April when baseball starts, and obviously there'll be the Masters, and just the ecosystem of DFS will be much better, and you'll have a big advantage as a FantasyLabs subscriber and as someone who's grinding it out right now.
All right, guys, awesome show. Thank you for being on it. Thanks to Adam Levitan for being our special guest. You can follow him on Twitter at Adam Levitan, and you can catch his work at DraftKings Playbook. And when we are lucky, you can find him at FantasyLabs. And then thanks to Justin and Peter as well for being on the show. You can follow them on Twitter at JFan and CSURam88. And that will do it for this episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matt Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Thanks for tuning in.